Welcome to this episode of Paranormal AF, the podcast where we spill the tea on all things paranormal. I'm your host, Rin. In this episode, we are going to talk about the curse of the Andelana, a ship so cursed that some believe it's continued to cause deaths long after its vanishing. This is a local story to Tacoma, and while we can debate if a ship can truly be cursed or not, this ship did truly exist and did vanish under mysterious circumstances here in Commencement Bay. For those of you who aren't local and don't immediately recognize the name Commencement Bay, you may be familiar with the area known as the Puget Sound. Many people think of it as the part of the Pacific Ocean that comes inland here in Washington State. Both Seattle and Tacoma are along the Puget Sound. But there is a bay of water at the port of Tacoma, and that bay is Commencement Bay. And this is the location of where the Andelana was last anchored. In this episode, we'll be looking at the facts surrounding the Andelana, as well as the mystery and the legends. I am a transplant here to the Pacific Northwest, but as soon as I heard about the Andelana, I was enthralled and knew that I'd have to do some research and an episode on this because I found this story just so interesting. We've got deaths at sea, a curse, strange or perhaps paranormal happenings, fortune tellers, a mysterious talisman, and even deaths that occurred after the fact that some attribute still to the curse of the Andelana. The ship definitely vanished in January of 1899, but I've seen the following dates reported: the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th. While sources don't agree on the date, most of them do agree that it sank on a Friday, and of those dates that I listed, in 1899, the 13th fell on a Friday. From my research, what happened is that it vanished during what we would consider Friday night, but it vanished sometime after midnight on that Friday night, which means that it technically disappeared on Saturday, the 14th. The one issue I have with this timeline is that in the evening, a photographer named Hester would take a photo of the crew of the Andelana and the ship itself, and then the ship would vanish later that night after him taking the photos. When I look at the photo online, every source that I have found dates the photo as being taken Saturday, January 14th, which would then mean that the ship disappeared over the course of Saturday night, not Friday night. But the source that I consider to be the most reliable dates the ship as vanishing on that Friday night, likely sometime after 2 a.m., without a single person seeing or hearing what happened when the Andelana vanished from Commencement Bay. I think that since the ship technically disappeared on the 14th, and it is known that the photo was taken the same day, just hours before the vanishing, that people are mistakenly dating the photo as being from January 14th when it was really taken on Friday the 13th. But I don't like to begin at the ending. So let's go back to the beginning because I really want to try to tell this story chronologically. The Andelana was built in 1889 by Richard Williamson and Son in Workington, England, and was a four-masted steel bark 300-foot-long vessel. It was the first of 6 sister ships known as the Workington Sisters. It set sail for the first time in October of 1889 with J. Gillis as captain, and it is under this captain that it is believed that the events that initiated or caused the curse happened. On November 24th, 1891, Captain Gillis and his entirely Japanese crew were sailing around Cape Horn when a very significant storm came up. There was a loose gasket, and two of the sailors climbed up into the rigging to try to handle it. Unfortunately, the wind was just too strong. One of the sailors fell from the rigging and into the ocean. The other fell to the deck, breaking his back. The man who fell into the water went under. Some reports say that the captain grabbed a life preserver with the intention of trying to save that sailor. But to the captain's shock and horror, he would see the sailor come up on the crest of a wave, look directly at the captain, smile, and then go under, never to be seen again. The second man lingered for 40 to 44 days, depending on the source you read, before he passed from his injuries. I have seen it reported that he passed on January 7th, 1892, but I'm not sure where this specific date comes from, but we do know that he did pass sometime that January. Unfortunately, the ship and crew never seemed to escape the storm from November. Captain Gillis would claim the storm followed them the entire time, and is the cause of why he chose the actions we are about to discuss. According to the captain, the storm was really hitting them hard. Winds were blowing, waves were crashing on the boat, and it was as bad as the night the two sailors fell from the rigging, and Captain Gillis was afraid of what tragedies would befall them, all of them, if all hands weren't on deck. The Japanese crew practiced Shinto, what some consider to be the indigenous religion of Japan, and when their crewmate passed on this night, during this raging storm, they asked Captain Gillis's permission to perform Shinto last rites for the crewmen. The captain said no, and according to some reports, went so far as to order them back to their posts at gunpoint. Why did he do this and deny his crew's request to perform last rites? This really doesn't seem like an unreasonable request from the crew at all. Because they were yet again caught in the awful storm, and the captain was too afraid that allowing the crew to be away from their post for any amount of time would bring disaster. And thus, he ordered the crew to bury the sailor at sea without final rite. You see, by this point, Captain Gillis had become more superstitious than the average sailor, and had developed a sincere fear of drowning. One of the reasons for this was because he had begun having a reoccurring dream in which his cabin filled with water in the middle of the night, and he was unable to escape, ultimately drowning. While it's often stated that Gillis became more superstitious, from what is described, I feel paranoid might be a better word. The curse of the Andelana likely began with the death of the first of the two Japanese crewmen back in November. But if, by some chance, that hadn't started it, Captain Gillis's refusal at gunpoint to let the crew perform final rites certainly would seem to be the incident that sealed the curse and the fate of the Andelana. In the Shinto faith, final rites are to be performed on the evening of the person's passing, and then again at specific intervals of time. The consequences for not performing last rites is that the person's spirit or kami can become angry or even vengeful, and their kami will stick to the area of their death. In the case of those who die at sea, their kami sticks to the vessel, and it becomes a specific type of vengeful spirit called the funuyore, which translates to boat spirit. And their ghostly mission is to make sure that anyone who has anything to do with the ship dies by drowning. So these two Japanese sailors who did not receive final rites would have become funuyore according to the Shinto beliefs. That year, 1892, Captain Gillis would quit as captain of the Andelana because he had become so superstitious and developed such an intense fear of drowning. It is also reported that he wrote about the night that the sailor drowning and stating that it haunted him for the rest of his life. There really isn't a lot to relay with the second captain, who was Captain J. Richards. He captained the Andelana from 1892 until 1894. Why such a short amount of time? Well, he also wrote about having a recurring dream about the cabin filling with water in the middle of the night and him being unable to escape, ultimately drowning. He would ultimately resign as captain for basically the same reasons as Gillis: fear. I also want to note that it is said that sometime during Gillis's captaining of the Andelana, that everyone who served on board her would suffer from severe fever, experience great tragedy, or both. Sometimes during the fevers, the crew were reported to speak Japanese, even though they didn't speak the language. We're talking about the crew that replaced the initial crew and were not Japanese. And others were overcome by a dark mood and would intentionally seek to sink the Andelana. This is reported to have begun during Gillis's time and to have continued after Richards took over captaining the Andelana, and also the third and final captain's time as well. This brings us to the third and final captain of the Andelana, Captain George W. Stalling. While he captained the ship from 1894 until it vanished in 1899, much of our story revolves around the last year of him captaining the ship. Very shortly after departing England in 1898, the Andelana and crew were caught in a storm that was so severe it broke 2 of the ship's masts and killed 5 of the sailors on board. Now, it's important to note that we believe those 2 sailors under Captain Gillis's captaining of the ship became Funayure because they were Japanese followers of the Shinto faith. But here we have more sailors killed on board the ship, so it's not beyond the realm of possibility for their spirits to have become attached to the vessel as well, though I would not call them Funayure. I would call them earthbound spirits, but that doesn't mean they didn't feel just as vengeful as the Funayure. And we're only covering the deaths I could find documented or discussed in my research. In the late 1800s, it's likely that Captain Gillis lost other sailors at sea, and it's statistically unlikely that Captain Richards made it through his time captaining the ship without losing anyone. All that to say that before Captain Stalling's first voyage on the Andelana gets underway, he's already got a band of spectral stowaways, and they likely number more than the 7 we've already covered. That storm was not to be the end of the misfortune to befall the Andelana on her last voyage. They limped the ship back to England to be repaired in port and then struck out to sea again. They would head to New York, but yet another storm would hit them, and they'd lose 4 more sailors. Our current known confirmed death toll is 11. Now, when that first storm hit, the one of the sailors was safe from the storm below deck, because just after leaving England, he came down with a severe fever. During this time, it was Captain Stalling who took care of the young sailor, who was only 17, just turning 18 years old at the time. His name was Richard Hansa, and I find this whole situation a bit odd. Apparently, Hansa had sort of a hero worship of the captain, and the 2 of them had formed a close relationship or bond very quickly. I personally find it very odd that a captain would nurse a sick sailor, and I also find the way the relationship is described as a bit odd as well. Now, perhaps Hansa's family knew Stalling, or Hansa had had some prior encounter with Stalling that explains their relationship and why a captain would nurse the lowest ranking person on his ship, but I did not come across any information along those lines. And please understand that I'm not insinuating that there was anything wrong if the 2 did have a close relationship. This just seems out of the norm for the time for me, and I normally would question if what follows wasn't an embellishment for the sake of adding to the legend. But Captain Stalling records in his logs that while he was caring for Hansa, it seemed as though, in his fever delirium, Hansa was repeating something in Japanese over and over again. Or at least, it sounded like Japanese to Captain Stalling, though he did not speak Japanese and didn't hazard a guess as to what Hansa was repeating in his fever. Here is something that I'd like you to keep in mind, though. Stalling likely knew of the deaths of the 2 Japanese sailors, and sailors are a naturally superstitious lot. Was Hansa repeating something in Japanese, or was he just mumbling, and because the curse was already on Stalling's mind, did that make him think Hansa was repeating Japanese phrases? When we take in the whole story, I'm not quick to discount that Hansa was, in fact, repeating phrases in Japanese during his fever, but we also can't rule out that Captain Stalling only perceived this to be the case due to the power of suggestion. Then, in South Africa, the crew was overcome by a sickness, and this is a separate or different sickness than the fevers that were reported to have been happening for the better part of 10 years. This sickness that they encountered in South Africa claimed more sailors' lives, and I don't have an exact number for how many died from this sickness. Accounts that I found just say more. They then headed to the coast of Java, which is one of the islands of Indonesia, and it is there that they were attacked by pirates. I am unaware if the crew took any casualties during the skirmish. I wasn't able to find that piece of information. But we can determine from the facts that we do have that a bare minimum of 13 people have lost their life on the Andelana by this point. We are being very conservative with this number, though. We know the 2 Japanese sailors. We know the 5 in the first storm. We know the 4 in the second storm. We know that more than one sailor died from the sickness in Africa, so I'm doing a very conservative estimate of 2 sailors there, which gives us our 13. But we also know that it's likely there were more deaths under Captain Gillis, that it's unlikely that Richards never lost a sailor, that likely more than 2 died of the sickness in South Africa, and it is quite possible that they took casualties in the pirate attack, which means that we are estimating low when I estimate 13 crew deaths. And this means we've got at least 13 potential pissed off spirits attached to this ship already, if not more. They then head up to China, and it is on their way there that they are hit by a typhoon. One of the things that happened during this typhoon is that some of the crew lost most of or all of their personal equipment and belongings. This will become a very important fact later in our story. It also broke one of the ship's masts yet again. By the time they arrive in Shanghai, of those still alive who started out the voyage in England, they are all firm believers that the ship is in fact cursed. Likely when they signed up to sail on the Andelana, they had already heard rumors that the ship was cursed, but either they didn't care or it didn't give much weight to the curse, or they thought that some of the traditional sailor superstitions would or could counteract the curse. But by Shanghai, the curse is undeniable, and the crew is now in fear, and yet another captain of the Andelana has grown more superstitious and, I argue, paranoid. Why had he grown paranoid? One reason was that, like the first 2 captains of the Andelana, he too was having the dream where his cabin would fill up with water in the middle of the night, and, unable to escape, he ultimately drowns. In addition to the dream, the crew becoming firm believers in the ship being cursed, made Captain Stalling fearful of a mutiny or the crew deserting the ship and him. For these reasons, it became Stalling's practice to lock the crew in at night below deck and to either refuse to let them go ashore or to go ashore only in a group of 2 or 3 at the most. He took these measures to prevent a mutiny or being deserted by his entire crew at once. If he only let a couple go ashore at a time, then only a couple at a time could desert him and the ship. 2 sailors were allowed to go ashore in Shanghai. They were Richard Hansa and his best friend on the ship, Percy Buck. Now, Buck lost all of his possessions in the typhoon, including his clothes, so he'd often borrow pants from Hansa. Hansa decides to see a palm reader while they are ashore. Buck goes with him but doesn't have his palm read. At first, the fortune teller is hesitant to read for Hansa. He kind of goes back and forth if he wants to read for him or not, but ultimately does read Hansa's palm. The fortune teller explains that he was hesitant to read for Hansa because something dark and evil follows Hansa wherever he goes. Whatever else he said to Hansa, we don't know, but it was compelling enough that the palm reader convinces Hansa to buy a protection talisman from him with the instructions that it has to be on Hansa's person at all times for it to work. Now, Hansa wrote to his family frequently, and in these letters he talks a good bit about the ship being cursed, and he says that once he took the talisman, he felt a great sense of calm and relief. I was not able to find anything saying who the palm reader he visited in Shanghai was. It could be that the palm reader he saw was a con artist who, knowing sailors were a superstitious lot, told every sailor that something dark followed him in order to make more money off of them. You can draw your own conclusions after you've heard all of the tale of the Andelana, but I'm inclined to believe that the fortune teller in Shanghai was genuine and sincere in what he told Hansa. After this, they would arrive in Commencement Bay on January 6th with a full crew of 28 men in the port of Tacoma. What we know as Tacoma today was originally smaller communities with similar names. So in 1899, they were not docked in Tacoma, but rather what was named Old Town Tacoma then. This was a pretty wild and woolly area, but it wasn't that large of an area. Yet, at that particular time in history, it boasted 13 to 20 saloons, as well as other forms of trouble for sailors to get themselves into. The area was so rough during that time that at night the police had to patrol in pairs, knowing that if they ever got separated during their shift, they likely would be dead before morning. There was a lot of fighting in this area and a lot of deaths due to fights that were never prosecuted as murders, but that's a whole nother story. As soon as the Andelana docked, 10 of the crew basically abandoned ship. They got off the ship without Captain Stalling's permission, and they demanded to be paid out and essentially made a run for it and fled into Old Town Tacoma. It appears that most of, if not all of them, did go and sign on to other ships, but the reputation of the Andelana spread through town with them, and Captain Stalling had a very difficult time replacing them. And those he did get to sign on to the crew of the Andelana for their next voyage out when they would depart Tacoma, he told them that they did not need to report to the ship until the day before they were to set sail out of Commencement Bay. While I haven't seen this stated anywhere, I suspect that he did this so that the crew couldn't scare off the new sign-ons with talk of the curse. If they had less exposure or no exposure to the crew before setting sail, they were less likely to get cold feet. But that part is my opinion. Of the 10 men who refused to remain on the Andelana, 1 was the second mate and 1 was the third mate. But there was also another man who left the ship shortly after docking in Old Town Tacoma as well. Robert Murdoch is said to have gone mad as the Andelana sailed from Shanghai to Tacoma, and upon arrival to Old Town Tacoma, he was taken into custody and placed in the very small jail that they had. On that fateful night of Friday the 13th, the Andelana was repositioned in the bay a little farther out from the dock. She was completely empty, so she was anchored and logs were chained to her sides to help her keep her steady. Another captain had mentioned to Stalling at about 4 p.m. on the 13th that he noticed that all of the Andelana's hatches were open. It is at some point during this evening that Wilhelm Hester took the photographs of the crew and the ship. Later, Captain Stalling was supposed to travel back to shore to dine with friends of his who owned the Seaman's Rest. This was probably the only reputable establishment for sailors in Old Town Tacoma besides the old St. Peter's Church. Here, sailors could get clean, write letters to loved ones, read a Bible, rent a room, or just generally find respite from the debauchery that was Old Town Tacoma. I've heard accounts that say Captain Stalling had originally planned to go to the Seaman's Rest that night, and that Percy Buck asked the captain's permission to go ashore with him so he could seek medical care, and the captain had indeed granted permission. I'm not inclined to give credence to this particular version, this little part of the story here. I feel that what I'm about to describe is likely more accurate and one I have seen in more reliable resources. Captain Stalling would decide to decline the dinner invitation, however, no matter which version you hear. And I've seen two different reasons for why he declined. One says that the captain was feeling physically unwell, perhaps the fever that plagued those who sailed on the Andelana. Other accounts say that it was because of his reoccurring nightmare and the fear that the crew would abandon him in the ship that he chose to stay on the ship that night. While in Old Town Tacoma, in the days before when the Andelana will vanish, Captain Stalling had written to his wife that this was to be his last voyage on the Andelana. He, like the two captains before him, was going to quit, and he was going to quit for the same reasons as the first two captains. He was right. This was to be Stalling's last voyage on the Andelana, but he was mistaken about the terms. Either way, he wrote a letter to the women who owned the Seaman's Rest telling them that he was declining their invitation this night, but would see them the following day. While some sources say Percy Buck was headed ashore already for medical care, more sources say he was simply sent to deliver the captain's message. But once he got to the Seaman's Rest, he was complaining of jaw pain and a fever, and it was the women who ran the Seaman's Rest who convinced him to seek medical care at the hospital rather than go back to the ship. He was checked into the hospital that night and was treated for an abscessed tooth. Captain Doughty had been the captain to point out the open hatches on the Andelana to Captain Stalling, and he was also at the Seaman's Rest on the 13th. He reports that he and 4 of his crewmen rowed back to their ship at around midnight that night. At that time, the Andelana was right where she had been anchored earlier in a perfectly calm Commencement Bay, and all of her hatches were still open. Sometime between 2 and 3 a.m. on the 14th, on what was calm waters, a sudden and strong squall suddenly rolled across Commencement Bay. Captain Doughty recounts how the sound of the wind woke him, but that by morning the weather was once again calm. But as he looked out on the bay from his ship, the Andelana was nowhere in sight. He rowed to shore for help, presuming that the Andelana had broken anchor and just drifted off. With the help of others, he and a couple of tugs, they set out to find the Andelana and tow her back. But they wouldn't find her. Instead, they found some floating documents, one of the logs that was used to stabilize the Andelana, a mattress marked as belonging to her, and one empty lifeboat. The Andelana had vanished during the night, and it became apparent to those searching that she must have sunk. What they believe happened is that because she was empty, the squall turned her broadside to the wind and then capsized her. With the hatches all open, she took on water very rapidly and sank extremely quickly. The captain in his quarters, 2 dogs, and 16 crewmen locked below deck, all unable to escape as the water filled their cabins in the middle of the night, and they ultimately drowned, without anyone in the bay seeing or hearing a thing. No chance to signal for help, no chance for rescue. They simply vanished into the bay during a freak squall that had come up during the night. Was it a freak weather-related accident? Or was the squall a tool of the Funiore and any other vengeful spirits attached to the ship? This is still considered the largest maritime disaster in Commencement Bay. You may be tempted to think that the curse of the Andelana ended when she sank, but you would be incorrect. There is indeed more to this story. At this point, we now have at least 30 known deaths connected to this ship, and remember, we are being conservative in our numbers. I'm not sure how long after, but after the sinking of the Andelana, Robert Murdoch, the crewman who went mad on the trip from Shanghai to Tacoma, well, he was released from jail and then meets a rather unusual end outside the old St. Peter's Church, which is still in the neighborhood of Old Town Tacoma. It is at this location that Murdoch reportedly, and I quote, mutilates himself to death. I'm not sure quite exactly what that means, but I know it's not good. We've been counting those who died on the ship, but we are going to start adding to that those whose deaths are attributed to the Andelana even after her sinking. We're now at 31. And those 10 sailors that got paid off and left the ship when they got into the port at Old Town Tacoma, it's been confirmed that 9 of them wound up having died during maritime accidents, and the fate of the 10th one is unknown. But we're now at 40. If you've watched the Pirates of the Caribbean, you may remember a scene where some people say that the Black Pearl leaves no survivors, but yet there's all these stories about the Black Pearl, etc. And Captain Jack points out that if they didn't leave any survivors, then how would anyone know the stories of the Black Pearl? Sort of a logic thing. You might wonder how we know so much about what happened on the Andelana during that last voyage. Mostly through letters that Stalling and the crew wrote. Some of Stalling's logs do exist, but also because Percy Buck survived, and he had some of Richard Hans's personal effects, including letters that were intended to be sent home. Speaking of Percy Buck surviving, yeah, about that. When he got up in the hospital on the morning of the 14th and began to get dressed, he was wearing a pair of pants that he had borrowed from his best friend Richard Hansa. He discovered, as he got dressed, that in the pocket of those pants was the talisman from the fortune teller in Shanghai. And we do know that this talisman absolutely did exist, but I'll get to that in a minute. A while after the sinking of the Andelana, Buck wanted to go back to Europe. For one, that is where he was from, and also because he wanted to give Hansa's effects back to his parents in Belgium. But he was understandably scared to sail again. He goes on to visit a very famous seer here in Tacoma by the name of Rebecca Carr, to ask her if it is safe for him to travel at sea again. Rebecca did not like to be called a fortune teller, but she made quite a name for herself, seeing for others, as she called it. Her story is very interesting, and I may dedicate an episode of the podcast just to her, but her method of seeing was psychometry, which is getting information through touch. And what Rebecca Carr did was she would ask her clients to bring her something to hold, something of theirs, preferably something they kept on them at all times or something that was very precious to them. When Percy Buck went to see her, the item he gave her to hold was the talisman from Shanghai. Miss Carr tells him that something dark is following him, but there is a protective shield around him and that he would make it safely back to Europe. Percy Buck then signs on to a ship called the Andelana and sails safely back to Europe, where he returns Hans's belongings, including the talisman from Shanghai, to his family. And this is how we know that the talisman really existed, because eventually Hans's family, they didn't really know what to do with his effects. So all of the stuff that Percy Buck had brought them, the letters they had gotten from him, some curiosities he had sent back to them while he was at sea, they placed all of that into a sea chest, and then that actually wound up in the hands of the museum ultimately in Europe. 1 year from the date that Percy Buck sailed back to Europe, he, now without the talisman, and the Andelana sailed back to the Tacoma area. During one night, a fierce storm whipped up, and in the storm, the captain of another ship saw a light signal that said, "This is the Andelana in need of help." Unfortunately, that ship was not able to aid the Andelana, and it too vanished into the storm with its crew of over 30. Now, this did not happen in Commencement Bay, but it did happen in the Puget Sound area, as I understand. Now, some say the curse of the Andelana transferred to the Andelana, who was also owned by the same company that owned the Andelana. But we are only going to add the death of Percy Buck to our count, which is now at 41. You'd think at this point that we're done with the curse, right? Like, this should wrap it up, right? Nope. They did try to recover the Andelana early on, and this was primarily for insurance reasons. A diver did go down to the location where the Andelana was marked as sinking, and he did find her. She was hooked up to chains, but for whatever reason, and it may be for what we're about to discuss, she was dragged about 100 feet closer to shore, but that was the end of that recovery attempt. Because you see, that diver met a very gruesome end. And I don't want to get too graphic, and you really could with this one, but we're going to try to keep it to the bare minimum. We're talking the turn of the 20th century here, and their diving equipment was quite a bit different than what we use today. The Andelana sunk in water that was 180 to 200 feet deep. While the diver was at that depth, there was a malfunction in his equipment. Now, some people attribute this malfunction to the curse because they say that this diver was very knowledgeable, experienced, and that the diver had thoroughly gone over his equipment before the dive. But what resulted was basically there was a fault in the equipment, a gasket was not right, and he was basically sucked into the tube that was intended to provide him air. And we're going to leave it at that. And with that, we're at 42 deaths that we can tie back to the Andelana. In the 1930s, another diver found the Andelana, which nobody else had been able to find by that point, and he brought up a piece of the ship and then suffered a heart attack shortly thereafter and died. This piece was a port light, and it is sometimes displayed at the Washington State History Museum in Tacoma. The reason that the port light isn't always on display is because people, including security guards at the museum, have reported either seeing a face smiling back at them through the port light or seeing the face of someone drowning through the port light. We're at 43 now. There are also reports of a third diver who had found the Andelana, or at least part of it, and they were going to bring up a piece of it, but couldn't for whatever reason, and I've never heard the reason as to why. It's reported that they drowned in their own bed, and that the coroner, through an autopsy, confirms that their cause of death was indeed death by drowning, and that they drowned on land in their bed, which brings us to 44. Over 152 dives or sonar attempts to find the Andelana were made. The vast majority of them were completely unsuccessful, until last year when Robert Mester, a local man who is a master diver and a marine salvage expert, found the resting place of the Andelana and crew using sonar. This means, as of 2020, we do know the location of the Andelana, and I beg you, do not go looking for it. Some local historians and Mester had planned trips out to do more sonar at the location, and every time something would happen to keep them from going. Serious things like a broken axle, issues with COVID-related health problems, and other severe medical issues. This is no joke. Will they ever go and attempt to recover the wreckage of the Andelana now that we do know where it is? Because for a long time it was a mystery. Most people had not realized that that initial salvage attempt had actually moved it by 100 feet. I can't see that they will ever attempt to recover it at this point because the floor of Commencement Bay, where it lies, is toxic silt. Not a joke, literally toxic. One of the reasons they had a hard time finding the Andelana, besides that many didn't realize it was 100 feet closer to shore than where it sank, is that the Andelana has sunk even deeper into that toxic silt over the years. We actually have quite a bit of seismic activity here. It's not like severe or significant seismic activity, but we have a lot of sort of low-level earthquakes. It's, very low on the Richter scale, but it happens a lot here. And the nature of this silt is that it doesn't take much of that seismic activity at all to turn the silt into a liquid that the Andelana has sunk deeper into over the years. It's not the depth, though, that is the issue. It's the silt itself. The silt that is at the bottom of Commencement Bay is made up of volcanic ash, runoff from deforestation, and pollution created by the Asarco company during the nearly 100 years they were smelting copper in Tacoma. There have been some areas that have undergone cleanup efforts, but when it comes to Commencement Bay, you can't really clean the silt out. So the safest and best course of action is to leave it there undisturbed. If anyone were to try to salvage the Andelana, it will require literal tons of the silt to be moved, which would cause an ecological disaster. So none of the agencies that would need to give the permission for the excavation of the Andelana would be willing to allow anyone to disturb that silt. This also means that the bodies of those sailors will likely never be recovered and will forever remain locked down below in that ship without proper burials. One of the things I like to suggest or I talk about when doing paranormal investigations is that we often see people investigate and sometimes even try to help any living people involved, but I personally feel we don't see enough of people trying to help the spirits in these places cross over or be put to rest. Sometimes the spirits in haunted locations don't want our help and will refuse it, but one thing I started to do years ago is that if I'm in a haunted location, I will offer, to the best of my ability, to help any of those spirits to cross over if they want to. I've got to tell you that I was watching a video about the Andelana from a local historian, and my heart just soared when he said he'd like to see someone of the Shinto faith and come out there to Commencement Bay and perform some kind of ritual, if there is one, for the sailor spirits. And I'd like to see that taken a step farther and see an interfaith group of clergy go to Commencement Bay and perform rites and rituals in order for all of those who lost their lives on the Andelana, perhaps even extend that to those that their deaths are attributed to the curse of the Andelana, to hopefully help all of those spirits find peace. But other than for that express purpose, I believe we should all leave the Andelana alone. I don't think it is even remotely a coincidence that she lies in toxic silt. She seems to clearly want to be left alone. By our conservative count, her curse is tied to 44 deaths. In addition to all the other possible deaths that could be attached to her that I've already mentioned, some might even argue that the crew of the Andrada and the crews of each of the ships that the 9 sailors signed onto should be included in this count as well. Which leaves us with the sobering realization that the curse of the Andelana actually could have taken hundreds of lives. I referenced that the local historians had some issues come up when they tried to go for another sonar attempt, and another historian alluded to having some other things, some strange things happen to them while just researching the Andelana, not even going out to the site. I have found over the years that when I am researching paranormal things, that sometimes I'll have a few odd things happen. Mostly, I attribute this to the fact that my mind frame is in the spooky zone and that I'm making connections where there isn't one, just because I'm in that spooky mindset. The first day that I started working on putting my notes together for this episode, I really wasn't in a spooky mind frame. Yes, this is a story about a curse and ghosts, but it's not the kind to give me the creeps. But I'm going to tell you what happened over the course of that day and the next day, and you can decide what you make of it. The building we live in was just built in December of 2020. Our unit doors lock automatically, and we don't have traditional keys, we have key cards. Office staff and maintenance do have master keys, but they don't just enter units. If they need to speak with a tenant, or if maintenance needs to come to repair something, if they need to come to your unit for whatever reason, they knock. If maintenance is scheduled to be there to fix something, they don't enter the units until they've knocked a few times and don't get an answer. I was working on my notes and sitting in a spot where I couldn't see the door to our unit itself. My husband was at work, my kids were at school, and I had talked to my husband about an hour and a half before this by phone. I hear the door to our unit open, and our building is inside access, so all doors open into a hallway. I'm photosensitive, so during the day, I just open the blinds and don't use any of the lights in our place. This is the Pacific Northwest, so that means it's pretty gray in our place when I'm the only one home. So I hear the door open, I see the light of the hallway hit the wall, and a person-shaped shadow. The sound of the sequence of events was just as if someone opened the door and walked into our place, letting the door close behind them. My first thought was, oh crap, my husband's sick or got hurt at work and has come home early, and I'm expecting him to walk into view. But he doesn't. So I say hello and I get up from where I'm sitting and head to the door. No one is there. No one is in our place. I quickly swing the door open and check the hallway. No one in sight. I start to question my sanity at this point. There's no way it was someone opening another door. And I just thought that I heard ours. Like it had to have been our door. This only leaves two possibilities, both equally disturbing in my mind. Possibility 1. Maintenance was sent to check on an empty unit and got the unit numbers confused. Upon opening the door to our place, they immediately realized they had the wrong place and allowed the door to just close. But they're supposed to knock before entering, even if they believe a unit to be empty. Also, I saw the person-shaped shadow move as if it was entering the room. Is it possible the person just didn't follow the knocking rule? Sure, people break rules at their jobs all of the time, but if this is the case, where did they go? They weren't in the hallway, and I would have heard a door if they had quickly ducked into another unit. And our doors here are really heavy, so you hear when one of our neighbors goes in or out of their place. And in fact, that's when you guys hear bumping in the background in these episodes, it's because people are going in and out of their places, and there's nothing I can do to get rid of that sound because the doors here are so heavy. Also, the units on either side of us and directly across the hall are all rented. So they're all full. It's not like they headed to an empty unit next to me and just opened the wrong door, because all these units right around us are rented. I'm going to throw an extra plot twist in here. There are a lot of stories of land being cursed or haunted here, and there are residents here and employees of the building we live in that believe our building is cursed or was built on cursed land. Now, we, since moving to the Pacific Northwest, have seen a lot of this type of thing happen. It's apparently really, really common here. In the time this building has been here, which is less than a year, there have been a lot of weird things go on here. I don't think our building is haunted per se, but I do think something is up with the land. I haven't gotten to the bottom of it, and I'm still not really sure what to make of the stuff that I've experienced here, that others have reported experiencing here, and stuff that we know, just weird things that have happened in this building since we've lived here, and apparently that stuff all started even before we moved in. So yes, strange stuff has occurred here. If it wasn't maintenance that opened my door, then that leaves something paranormal. And to be perfectly honest, I'm not sure which is more unsettling to me. At the point after this happened, I was leaning towards maintenance making a bad boo-boo, and that someone, a living flesh and blood person, had accidentally come into our unit rather than the unit they were supposed to go to, and that they just didn't follow proper procedure for maintenance. This was between 1:30 and 2 p.m. At a few minutes after 3 o'clock p.m., I went to go wait for my oldest at his bus stop. 2 doors down the hallway, I realized I had forgotten to grab my phone, something I never do. I turned around to go back to our place and grab it, and of course, wouldn't you know it, my key's suddenly not working. I went down to the office real quick to get my key fixed before I went out to get him, and the young lady in the office told me that it was the weirdest thing. They'd been having trouble all over the building with keys not working that day. Interesting. In the time that we've lived here, I've never had maintenance just walk into our place unannounced, and they've never had an issue with the keys not wanting to work building-wide. But I'm thinking this is just some odd stuff at this point. I walk down to the bus stop and sit down to wait for my son and his bus. It was a lovely fall day. To my right, at the end of our building's property, it slopes up to a hill where the train tracks are, and then there's a stand of trees on the other side. I'm sitting there enjoying the weather when something on the other side of those trees bursts into flames, and black smoke begins to billow up into the sky. The fire station is less than a half a mile from us, so fire trucks are there in minutes, and whatever caught on fire is quickly extinguished. And no, despite the fact that we've been past there several times, we cannot figure out what the heck burst into flames over there. At this point, I'm like, this day is just not normal, and it's getting creepy, and I am starting to think something is up and that maybe it's connected to the research and this project. Be it someone or something that opened my front door, the weird key malfunction, and now something bursting into flames right by me. I'm like, I'm thinking something's up. And we still, like I said, don't even know what it was that caught on fire. The next day, seems like it was going fine, but then as I was digging for some more information and to confirm some information I had, I accidentally found the now known location of the Andelana. Up to that point, I had managed avoiding finding the information as to where the ship lies. I really didn't want that information. Didn't want that on my hands. But by accident, I'm scrolling looking to confirm the names of the crew and where they were from and some other things. And I'm scrolling, and then bam, right in my face is a picture of the sonar and exactly where the location of the Andelana is. Are you kidding me? So, when my son, who like me sees spirits, got home from school on that second day, he told me that he had seen something while he was at school. The interesting thing is that while I was waiting for him to get home on the bus, I happened to see something. At this point, whether it's all just weird coincidence or not, I felt that I needed to do something. I promised the spirits of the Andelana that I would not seek out the ship or to communicate with any of them, and that all I wanted for them was peace, and that I also would not share the location of the Andelana with anyone. In the days since I have made that promise, we have been devoid of strange occurrences, and neither I nor my son have seen the spirits we saw that day since. Nothing else freaky or weird happened, and we didn't see them again since I've made that promise. I think it's safe to say I do firmly believe in the curse of the Andelana at this point, and that while it is important for us to tell their story, it is also important for us to leave well enough alone. The only action I think the spirits might even accept from us is for representatives of the various phase of the crewmen to attempt to help them find peace. We mentioned superstitions a lot in this episode. I just want to mention one more sort of ripple from the vanishing of the Andelana. Wilhelm Hester was famous for his photographs of ships and crew here in the Pacific Northwest. He had quite a good business selling these photos to the sailors. After the sinking of the Andelana, he wrote to Hans's family, and the letter says that he took 2 pictures of the crew and a picture of the ship. But only one photo of the crew is known to exist. There are efforts by historians at a local museum to try to track down the missing photos. Supposedly, Hester photographed the whole crew, and this was done at the request of Captain Stalling as a sort of morale booster. Here's the odd thing. There are only 15 men in the photo, but there are 17 crew at the time, including the captain, that went down with the ship. And one of the people in the photo is Percy Buck, so he wasn't even on the ship when it went down. Legend says that after the Andelana sunk, Hester became superstitious. Thereafter, he would never photograph an entire crew at one time again. He always asked one member of the crew to step out of the photo, believing that otherwise they'd meet a similar fate to the Andelana. To be honest, I'm a little skeptical about this story. The photo that is known actually doesn't have the full crew in it. There are only 15 men pictured in the photo, and as I said, one of whom is Percy Buck, who didn't go down with the ship. This means that of the 17 men who drowned, only 14 of them are in the photo. Meaning that the photo, this one that we have that we know of, it really shouldn't or wouldn't prompt such a superstition in Hester since all of the crew isn't in it. If the legend is true, then perhaps the missing crew photo is of the full crew. And if that is the case, how wild and creepy is it that the ship and crew have been missing all of this time because nobody knew where they were until 2020? They had kind of been found and lost until 2020. And at the same time, the photo, potentially of the full crew and the ship, have also been missing all this time. That's kind of creepy, in my personal opinion. I hope that you've enjoyed today's episode of Paranormal AF. Thank you for listening. Please share the podcast with your friends. I'll see you Paranormal AF spooky mother lovers in the next episode.